Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a beautiful, smoky day in Kennewick, sunshiny. I want to welcome everybody on the Cybercast and on any phone hookups or anything else, or those that will be listening to this later. I have a Facebook account that I really never seem to use. Over the years, I have flagged a few people as friends, and when notices come up on my phone. As a result, I usually get to see 1 or 2 messages a week that are pushed to my phone, probably through some sort of an algorithm. A couple weeks ago, I saw a post that I thought was rather interesting. I think it was a post forwarded to me based on a friend that I have with Facebook. And in this case, it was a quote from someone that is not on my friend list, but I noticed a couple of people that are on my friend list that made comments about the post. I presume the author of what I want to read to you is a person by the name of Bethel Dach. D-A-C-H is the last name. Again, I don't know how this works, but I think Bethel post got to me, sent to me by Facebook through a friend. Perhaps the name could even be fake, or what is called a pseudonym, but the post occurred on, I believe, about August 15th of this year. The post said, "There isn't a woman in the Bible that God used who had it easy. Ruth didn't have it easy. Esther didn't have it easy. Sarah didn't have it easy. Hannah didn't have it easy. Bathsheba didn't have it easy. Mary didn't have it easy. And the woman at the well and the woman with the issue didn't have it easy." Y'all better stop falling for that feel-good gospel and recognize that God's daughters don't have it easy. All 8 of the women listed faced challenges and had faith in God and sought his intervention in their lives. Bethel's list lists only a portion of the faithful women described in the Bible. Some of us may fantasize about how we would have acted if we were the ones being described. Often people romanticize the life of those described, and it might be easy to have how it might have been easy for them to remain faithful. I think that is part of what the author of the Facebook post was getting at. When we fantasize, we often forget the hardship they went through. My title here today is Not Always Easy. The goal is to consider that our lives are not expected to be easy, and that God has a reason why we can expect to have trials along the way. In this first section, I want to review what these women had to endure from the perspective of the fact that they did not have it easy. I will not necessarily be looking at the story flow of their lives, but rather looking at interesting scriptures that support the conclusion that things for them were not always so rosy as we might imagine. If you turn over to Leviticus 19, Ruth suffered the anguish of losing her husband. And I'm going to go down the list, basically the list as they were listed out. And as a widow, she chose to continue her relationship with her mother in spite of the fact that her mother-in-law was also poor and nearly destitute as a widow, with no sons or husband to protect and provide for her. Ruth was a Moabite, but chose to have faith in our God. She could have returned to her father's house, probably remarried, and lived comfortably. Rather, she accompanied her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, where she had to glean with the poor and other foreigners for food. In Leviticus 19, it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest." Verse 10, "And you shall not glean your vineyards, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." God commanded the people of Israel to provide for the poor and the foreigners. Ruth was poor. She was able to glean. Esther is a revered heroine listed in the Bible that suffered hardship. She was an orphan raised by her uncle. She was beautiful, which can potentially be the source of a problem for women. And so it was for Esther. She and many other beautiful young virgins were carried away by the king's servants to serve as female companions for the king for potentially only one night. After spending time with the king, she would likely spend the rest of her life as a concubine, sequestered under guard in a home for women. Unless she happened to become pregnant by the king, she would no longer expect to have children, a husband, or a wholesome and satisfying family life as a wife and mother. She would be a prisoner with no home to manage, goals to set, opportunities for success in her own endeavors. Imagine the competitive, backbiting, and mean-spirited competition among the women as they tried to vie and make themselves the one to win the king's favor and be elevated to a position of prominence. The glamorous Queen Esther experienced significant trials even after she became queen. For example, her life was in danger if she ever approached the king without first being summoned by the king. Sarah was also a beautiful woman. She was married to Abraham, but was unable to have children. When they were faced with a famine, she had to deal with the fact that her husband was willing to give her up to another man in order to get food and save his life. If God had not intervened, she would have likely become a concubine for another man. Because she had no children, she encouraged her husband to try to have children with another woman. The other woman became pregnant and then became abusive to Sarah, stirring up great emotional trials for both women and their sons. And then a second time, her husband failed to protect her and allowed her to be taken away by another man. Again, God intervened, yet at times she must have felt very insecure. Sarah suffered through many challenges. If you turn over to 1 Samuel 1, Hannah was also unable to have children. She was married to a man that had 2 wives. The other wife had children. Apparently, because she was able to have children, she considered herself better than Hannah and felt entitled to be mean and abusive. The other wife made Hannah's life full of unbearable anguish and emotional pain. In her anguish, Hannah pleaded with God for a son. In 1 Samuel 1, chapter 1, I want to begin in verse 10. And this is talking about Hannah. "And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, 'O Lord, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your handmaid and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head.'" Because of her prayer, God blessed her with a son that she named Samuel. As soon as her son was weaned, she took him to the priest and gave him to serve the Lord. From then on, she only saw her son once a year. If you'll skip over to chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, and we'll read verse 18, 1 Samuel 2 and verse 18. But Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother used to make him a little robe and bring it to him year by year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Hannah's life was clearly not without trials. Bathsheba was married to a soldier. He was a man that apparently cared more about his work, his boss, and the men that he worked with than his wife. I can only imagine the loneliness she must have felt and the sense of being trapped in such a marriage. She was not alone. When a nation is at war, there are many women suffering the same trials of loneliness through near abandonment. But in our society today, women suffer the same trials. For Bathsheba, her problem became greater through a sexual affair with the king. The affair resulted in the death of her husband and the loss of her firstborn son. She ended up being married to the king as one of his many wives and the mother of one of his many children. In reality, not much better emotional circumstance than the king's many concubines. And consider the Samaritan woman who spoke to Jesus at the well. In the course of the conversation, she was given the privilege to understand that he was the Messiah. When she met Jesus, she was a woman living in sin. She was living with a man that was not her husband. Prior to him, she had been married 5 times before. The Bible does not indicate that she had been widowed 5 times or divorced. My impression is that she was divorced. Going in and out of intimate relationships is nearly always a very painful and unproductive way to live. My observations in life lead me to believe that she was likely a very unhappy woman. If you turn over to Mark chapter 5, imagine being sick for 12 years with an unclean condition that would constantly sap your strength and steal your energy. The woman with the issue wanted to do what she could to get better. She went to the physicians in hope that they would cure her infirmities. In her attempt to do so, she ended up spending all of her money on physicians and was still not better. In Mark 5 and verse 25, Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched my clothes?' Or 'Who touched me?' And he looked around to see her who had done this thing, but the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." I'm sure there were plenty of other women, faithful women in Israel, that suffered the same or similar infirmities without being healed. Even today, we have faithful women and men that suffer horrible infirmities and disadvantages without relief. Life for all of us has its challenges. We all have burdens to bear. Mary, the mother of Jesus, did not have it easy. As we shall see, there is a very good chance she and her husband were very poor. I want to show you the evidence of that. Turn to Leviticus 12. This chapter in Leviticus 12 is where the laws are given for the purification of a woman when she gives birth to a child. In Leviticus 12, verse 1 through 3, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a woman has conceived and borne a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as in the days of her customary impurity she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. If her child was a boy, her days for purification were 33 days, and for a girl 66 days. At the end of those days, or the end of the days required for purification, for either a boy or a girl, she was to bring a lamb as a burnt offering and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering to the priest." And this is described beginning in verse 6. And this is Leviticus 12, verse 6, when the days of her purification were fulfilled, whether for a son or a daughter, she shall bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleaned from the flow of her blood. This is the law of her who has borne a male or a female. And if she is not able to bring a lamb, then she may bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. Notice the accommodation for a poor woman to substitute the lamb with a bird for the burnt offering. The bird was of far less value than the lamb of its first. So the bird was of far less value than the lamb. So if you'll turn over to Luke 2, and we will start in verse 22. And here in Luke is the indication that Mary was poor. Notice the offerings that were made at the end of her days of purification. In Luke 2, in verse 22, it says, "Now when the days of her purification, according to the law of Moses, were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord." Skipping down to verse 24, "And to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves and 2 young pigeons." Apparently, they were unable to offer a lamb for the burnt offering. The alternative, as we saw in Leviticus, for someone that was poor was to substitute a pigeon or a turtle dove for the lamb. Imagine that. She was the woman that received such a high blessing and honor as to be the mother of the long-awaited Messiah. Through her, the God being that all of creation was created through became part of the creation. She and her husband could not afford a lamb. Turn back in Luke a chapter to chapter 1, beginning in verse 46. This is when Mary had just arrived at the home of Elizabeth, her relative, and the 2 women were discussing the amazing miracles that were happening to them. In Luke 1 and verse 46, and Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit has rejoiced in God my Savior, for he has regarded the lowly state of his maidservant. For behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done this great things for me, and holy is his name. And mercy is on those who fear him from generation to generation." Mary's lowly state, as she described it, certainly contradicts my thoughts of what I would expect the conditions to be like for the arrival of such an important person as her son, the Messiah. All of these women demonstrated faith in God even through adversities. Their faith was not based on their lives being easy. Their faith was because they trusted God. Turn over to Hebrews 11. The point of listing those heroines of the Bible in the Facebook post was that they lived lives full of difficulty. Following their example, we should not lose faith when we also face difficulties in our lives. Their lives were not easy, yet their faith brought about blessings. There are many more women of note listed in the Bible, beyond the 8 that were listed in the Facebook post. Hebrews 11, the chapter we often call the faith chapter, brings attention to 3 women of faith and gives reference to many more. In Hebrews 11, verse 11, by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Sarah was listed in the Facebook post. As we have already noted, she suffered many trials, yet she is listed as one that maintained her faith in Almighty God. Let's skip down to verse 23 of Hebrews 11. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Moses' parents were from the tribe of Levi. His father was Amram, and his mother was Jochebed. In the midst of horrible oppression and hard times under a regime bent on destroying Hebrew children, his mother was able to nurse her son, see him actually grow up to be a prominent person in Egypt. And skip down to verse 31. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace. And if you remember, harlot was the lady, Rahab was the lady in Jericho. There were many other women of faith that suffered hard times. And this is also in Hebrews verse 35, and this is the many other women that I'm referencing. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. The women highlighted in Hebrews 11 were highlighted for their faith, not for their blessings or having an easy life. They were all faithful despite their hardships. If you'll turn over to Deuteronomy 5. There is a belief held by many that if we believe in God, we will not have hardship. The belief is that those that are righteous are prosperous, and those that are wicked suffer hardship. The truth is, God does promise blessings to come our way for keeping his laws and following the way of righteousness. Now we'll look into that a little more deeply. Deuteronomy 5:29. Oh, that they had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. What I don't think is clearly understood is that those blessings are normally the result of the wisdom we gain from following God's commandments. I'm not saying that God does not intervene with blessings. I want to emphasize that God has established that making good decisions brings about blessings. Turn over to Psalm 19 of the book of Psalms. Psalm 19. The wisdom we gain from obeying God allows us to avoid the natural consequences of sin. In Psalm 19, beginning in verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The statutes are based on the commandments that are the fundamentals of the law. God's desire is that we rejoice in our understanding of God's hope for us. Continuing in verse 8, the commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. We gain understanding through the commandments. The fear of the Lord is clean and enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And verse 10, more to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. God desires that we understand and internalize His laws and His statutes, and that we revere Him with great respect and worship. Riches can be taken away from us. Gold is like cash. When I think of cash, I think of a fistful of dollars. A fistful of dollars can run through your fingers as quickly as water. If you do not invest those dollars into something that will make you money, it will soon be gone, just like holding water in your fingers. Similar to investing money, the fear of God, along with keeping His commandments and judgments that have been internalized into your mind and heart, will produce profit and joy sweeter than honey. If you do not internalize righteousness into your heart and mind, you will lose it just like water running through your fingers. Continuing in verse 10, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. In verse 11, moreover, by them your servant is warned. Commandments are a warning, and in keeping them there is a great reward. The wise person that understands and keeps God's laws and judgments can usually avoid making foolish and destructive decisions which have the consequences of creating hardship. Turn over to Isaiah 3. Isaiah 3. Health, prosperity, and joy are natural consequences of righteousness. Here in Isaiah, in this verse in Isaiah is actually God, Jehovah, speaking. In Isaiah 3 and verse 10, it says, say to the righteous that it will be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. So what they're doing is producing the fruit. And if they're righteous, it's going to produce good fruit. It's automatic. The natural consequences of sin make our life more difficult. In verse 11, it says, woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hands shall be given him. God is not constantly intervening in our lives by controlling and nudging others aside for our benefit. Some people think and teach that if we believe and trust in God, He will control events in our lives that will make us healthy, happy, and profitable. The fact is, He has established systems that automatically produce results. The consequences of obeying the laws of God are what bring about blessings. The laws of blessings and cursings are spiritual laws of nature similar to the law of gravity. The law of gravity can be resisted and even ignored, but only for a while. God has designed this life to be challenging as a part of the normal course of events. Hardship develops and refines us. If you turn over to Job, first chapter of Job, Job 1, Job was a righteous man, and God said that he was blameless and upright, and that there was no one else that was up to the standards that Job had achieved. In Job 1, verse 8, it says, "Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" In spite of the level of righteous character that Job had, God still allowed him to be tested. If you'll turn to the end of the chapter now to Job 42. Job 42, hardship and trials are a natural part of our existence. Bad things do happen to good people. God allowed bad things to happen to Job. They did not happen to Job because he was a sinner or practicing wickedness. God publicly commended Job in heaven because of his righteousness. Job lost nearly everything that was dear to him over events that could conceivably happen to anyone. Many things happen to us based on nothing more than time and chance. In Job's case, the terrible tragedies were intentionally brought on by Satan. The trials refined Job to have an even greater understanding of God and his ways of righteousness. After the trials, he repented of his errors of understanding. In Job 42 and verse 5, Job 42 and verse 5, it says, "I have heard of you," this is Job speaking, "by the hearing of the ear. But now my eye sees you. I understand, I get it now, or I have better understanding. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes." I actually suspect that all of us will consider ourselves abhorrent when we finally do see God. We will likely wish that we had tried harder and done better. In verse 12, "Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 in the list of things that Job had, and the increase. The natural results of what Job learned and practiced produce even greater wealth and blessings than he had before." We can expect trials in this life, as well as times of great joy and pleasure. This life was not designed to be easy. The events in our lives are for our edification and growing toward righteous character. Part of that process requires us to learn the realities of life. Life is not always easy for our benefit.
Thank you, Alan. We do appreciate the message.
Those are some amazing figures that Rick just gave. I wish I had those for my sermon, my message today. They would have fit in quite well. Well, I want to say hello to everyone, and hope you're all having a good Sabbath. Hello to Jennifer. As Rick and Gordon mentioned, we've been through the fire and the smoke more closely up in Spokane, but with God's blessing and God's intervention, we've made it through. So it's been a bit of a rough time, really, for a lot of us up there, and nobody that we know of in the church has had a real problem. But it's a beautiful morning here in Kennewick, and heating up. It's still summer. I looked at the web page this morning for the weather. It's supposed to be 97 here this afternoon, so we're still in summer. And just for fun, I I checked Everett, Washington, which is north of Seattle, my old hometown where I grew up. And they've got a high heat advisory over there. It's supposed to be 82 today. So it's just what you're used to, I guess. My title today is Seeing God. And I'm talking about God the Father. And to me, seeing God is something that's vitally important to us in our Christian lives. But I'd like to start by turning to John 1:18. If I can find it. John 1:18, no one has seen God at any time. Only the begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, has declared him. So, is there a contradiction here? Well, there's a little bit more to the story. I'd like to turn back to Exodus 33. Here Moses was up on the mountain with God, God the Father. In Exodus 33, starting in verse 18, and he said, this is Moses talking, please show me your glory. And then as God said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live. And the Lord said, here is the place by me, and you shall stand on the rock, and so it shall be while my glory passes by, that I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and will cover you with my hand while I pass by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back part, but my face shall not be seen. So God did let Moses see the back part of him, but he couldn't see his face. He says, no one can see my face and live. So whenever God spoke to mankind, he spoke from a cloud so that he was shielded, that he wouldn't destroy those he was talking to. So we can't see God directly, but we can learn a great deal about God, and it's our responsibility to do so. And there are different ways of seeing. There are many things that we can't see directly, which we can still learn about, and that doesn't mean we can't see them indirectly. I think as mentioned, we can't see gravity, but we can certainly feel the effects of it. We can't see a magnetic field, but back in school, I remember we would take a magnet and put a piece of paper over it and sprinkle some iron filings on it, and there was a picture of the magnetic field. This is as clear as anything. So there are ways of seeing things. So a lot of things we can't see directly, we can see indirectly. I'd like to turn to John 3 verse 8, talking about spirit beings here. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. So we can't see spirit beings. We can't see them unless they want us to see them, in which case they can make themselves available for us to see. So how can we see God the Father? Well, not visually, but I would like to consider 4 ways that we really can come to know all that we need to know about God, at least in this present age. And I think this will give us a good mind's eye vision, really, of God the Father. Number 1 is God's design in creation, and I think Rick really touched on that as far as the human body goes, but let's look at Romans 1:20, which is very familiar. Romans 1 verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they're without excuse. So there are two very different categories of living things that we categorize as animal and vegetable. So how could these have evolved from a single cell that supposedly came out of a swamp someplace, according to evolution? It really doesn't add up. So it doesn't really make any sense from an evolutionary perspective, but it does from a design perspective. So God made two major divisions of living things as an essential part of his creation. God designed the human body and the animals, all things that can move about and do things, and God saw the need to feed them. So he designed food for all these creatures, and hence the vegetation. All food ultimately comes from the soil, which is where God put the nutrients. Fixed plants derive the nutrients from the soil. We humans eat vegetables and animals. There are animals that eat animals. But ultimately, everything comes from the ground. Everything comes from vegetation. We eat the cows, and the cows eat the grass. I remember when I worked in Bowie many years ago, there was an engineer there that was kind of a jokester, and he claimed to be an anti-vegetarian, and he said, I let the cow eat the grass, and I eat the whole cow. So, and God also created the sun as a necessary source of energy for all these living things. So we can witness a completely designed system, the overall system, where God created everything he needed for all the living needs, all that's necessary for life. And again, Rick mentioned some things in the human body. The human body contains about 75 trillion cells. Here we shed so many in one day, but 75 trillion is hard to imagine. They're all programmed to continually manufacture components to maintain themselves. And the probability of this programming really is a random function, or that's really mathematically zero. I'd like to turn to Psalm 139. Psalm 39, starting in verse 14. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they all were written. The days fashioned me, while as yet there were none of them. So David said he was fearfully and wonderfully made, and if there's ever an understatement, really that's it. Now God looks at the human body for design ideas. When we look at robots, what do we see? We see things that are kind of designed after the human body. Birds inspired man to create flying machines. Number two, God's intervention in human affairs. So we can come to see God when we witness either his actions in our human affairs or even in our own lives. Nehemiah Gordon wrote a book titled Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence, and he called these things God incidences. And Gordon wrote of a sequence of events that caused him to just barely miss being in front of a cafe when it was destroyed by a suicide bomber. So he mentioned that as a God instance in his own life. Well, Karen and I recently watched the video of Joseph, and it portrayed the sequence of events that God caused to happen there in Joseph's life. that brought him up to be the second in command of all of Egypt. And it was clearly a sequence that was guided by God. So God inspired Joseph's dreams, which caused his brothers to hate him, so they sold him as a slave into Egypt. Joseph was bought by Potiphar, and then Potiphar's wife, through her lies, caused him to be sent to prison. And in prison, Joseph interpreted the dreams of Potiphar's butler and baker, which led to Joseph being led into the presence of Potiphar to interpret Potiphar's dream. And Potiphar, seeing Joseph's wisdom and how close he was to God, made him second in command to Egypt. So it was a sequence of events, really, that God orchestrated there. I believe God's hand was behind many things that took place here in the U.S. during World War II. The way things came together, really, to help us to defeat the Axis powers, really, I think was phenomenal. We had vast resources of material. We had hydropower to smelt aluminum. We were able to design and produce war materials. It was ramped up to just an astounding level. One Ford plant was turning out one B-24 bomber every 29 minutes, if you can imagine that. So somewhere there had to be produced 4 engines, and all the electronic equipment, the armaments, everything had to come together, and all these things, produced at that rate, which is really amazing. And you can imagine the supply chain problems that had to be overcome. Now today we have supply chain problems with baby food, and it takes us months to iron that out. So could man, on his own will, really have organized all that took place? I don't really see how it could have been without God's intervention. There is a God incident in my own life which has always stood out in my memory, and I mentioned it before some time ago on a sermonette, but it fits here, and it's what I experienced the first time I tried tithing. I had begun listening to the World Tomorrow broadcast and started ordering some of the booklets and reading them. And after I read the tithing booklet, I said, well, I'll try that, see what happens. And at the time, I was living in a dormitory room at the University of Washington, and my income was about $50 a month just from part-time work on the janitor crew. And so I said, well, I'll just put $5 in an envelope and address it to Pasadena, to the headquarters there, and it was anonymous. So I put the $5 in an envelope, and I dropped it in the mail chute and went off to class. And I came back in the afternoon, and there was a letter in my mailbox from my grandmother with a $5 bill in it. So, and my grandmother had never sent me money, and never did after that. And somehow, God needed to know how long it would take for that mail to get there, and for when Grandma had to mail the letter, and when I was going to mail the one to Pasadena, and he had it all worked out. Well, a month went by, and I said, well, I'll try this again. So I put $5 in an envelope and addressed it to Pasadena, and I dropped it in the mail chute. I went off to class, came back, and there was a letter from an insurance company, and it had a check in there for $5 and a few cents. So I got a little tiny bonus there. It was from a whole life policy that my mother had taken out when I was an infant, and I had forgotten all about it. And somehow, this letter had found me there at the university in this particular day. So anyway, some people would call these coincidences. In my mind, no way. It could have been. It was a God instance, or 2 instances really, that I think showed me is here's where I needed to be. And it was where I needed to be. The third way, I think, is prophecy. The fulfilling of Daniel's prophecy of the sequential kingdoms of Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome is well documented. And many people have argued that this was so correct, it must have been written after the fact. Well, I actually gave a message about this not too long ago, that you can really counter all those arguments that Daniel did write back before all of this happened, and you can prove that. So, and there are prophecies about really our time now, I think, that really are happening before our very eyes. I'd like to look at just a few things here. Isaiah 3. Isaiah 3, verse 12. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, those who lead you cause you to err, and destroy the way of your paths. So today we see these flash mobs of young people that are emptying out stores. We see just what happened to our building here from some young people that were driving really recklessly outside. There's mass shootings in schools that are being carried out by young people that just find a gun and take it and start, shooting other children and teachers. Daniel 12. Daniel 12, verse 4. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be much increased. Well, I think you can certainly see that. We're running to and fro, all the people that are traveling, and we've done so much traveling on planes around the world. And as far as the technology, I have a little hearing aids now that we wouldn't even imagine, not too many years ago. And we keep hearing that knowledge is increasing exponentially year after year. So that really is pointing to our times that we're in. And Matthew 24, about the end time. Matthew 24, verse 21. For then there shall be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh shall be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So this world really has become totally unstable. I just got off the internet that it's estimated that there are 12,700 nuclear warheads in 6 different countries right now. And it kind of boggles my mind. God gave us minds to think, how could we come to this point where we build enough destructive power to destroy the whole earth and all human beings? It just doesn't make sense as far as any logical thinking, because really it's not logical thinking. It's Satan-inspired thinking that's doing this. And we see countries that are really ruled by demon-possessed people, and our own government is really stymied as far as accomplishing things that need to be done. So today we are experiencing really this prophecy being fulfilled before our very eyes. That we are in the end time, and you can see it really through all these prophecies. And we can see, I think, God's hand in bringing us to this point. He's showing us evil, really rubbing our nose in it, so that when His kingdom comes, it'll be such an awesome thing to behold, and to see the difference between God's way and man's way. So, there is purpose behind it, and God is allowing Satan to do these things right now. Well, the fourth point is we can see God, of course, through Jesus Christ. and John 14. John 14, starting in verse 7. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. For from now on you know him and have seen him. So Christ is saying we see the Father through him. And Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. And Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. So one purpose of Christ's coming was to show us the Father, the Father's characteristics. God allotted 4 books of the Bible, really, to relate the life of Jesus Christ and to show us, really, the Father through Jesus Christ. What Christ taught, his feelings, his emotion. I'd like to turn to John 1. John 1, verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So Christ was full of grace and truth. You know, the Bible tells of how he looked at Jerusalem and just wanted to cuddle these people like a mother hen would under their wings, and they weren't willing. So he had that emotion and that love that he showed. And we can see Christ's characteristics really through the Gospels, and God gave us all that material in the Bible to reveal what Christ was like, and through him, God the Father. So we can see, really, Christ's love, his empathy, and emotion, and even tears. So again, Christ said, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. And the Bible says the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. So God is saying, what more could I possibly show you?